Today, we're in lesson 5 of our course, Understanding the Old Testament. And this is the second lesson of the historical books. Now, I always want to mention that in the description of this lesson, you will find a link where you can download a copy of the PDF worksheet. And you can work right from that download. You don't have to print it out or anything. But it's important that you download it and that you work along, because at the end of the lesson, we will be looking over the questions that are found in that worksheet. And I also oftentimes will put charts or things like that in the worksheet that you can look at later if you go ahead and download it now. So last time we looked at the conquest and life in Canaan. We went through Joshua, which was talking all about conquering Canaan. We went through Judges, which it focused on settling Canaan. And then we went through the book of Ruth, which really talks about providential grace. Now, today we will begin looking at the Israelite Empire and the phases in Israel's history. So this would be the United Kingdom, the divided kingdom, and the surviving kingdom. Despite occasional hostility, the nation remained united under both David's wartime rule and Solomon's peaceful leadership. However, soon after Solomon's death, the tribes separated into the northern kingdom, this would be Israel, and the southern kingdom, or Judah. While David's descendants ruled Judah, the northern kingdom was ruled by increasingly wicked kings, and it did not last very long. So in this lesson specifically, we will be looking at the kingdom beginnings. This is found in 1 Samuel. We'll also be looking at David's reign in 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. And then we will look at Solomon's reign in 1 Kings 1 through 11 and 2 Chronicles 1 through 9. I will also be assigning you some more homework for the week. But before we do that, let's get into our first topic. The Israelite kingdom beginnings take place in the book of 1 Samuel. Now, I've mentioned this previously, but I'll mention it once again. In the Hebrew canon, 1st and 2nd Samuel are combined into one book. There are a couple of significant characteristics of 1 Samuel that are worth mentioning. First of all, 1 Samuel records the point at which Israel turned from judges to kings. 1 Samuel also covers 3 major leadership changes in approximately 100 years, from Samuel's birth to Saul's death. So this would be about 1105 to 1010 BC. It provides a historical link between the book of Judges and the book of Kings. When it comes to authorship, the Babylonian Talmud credits Samuel with the authorship of the 2 books that bear his name. However, it's worth mentioning that Samuel dies, and his death is mentioned twice before the end of 1 Samuel. So the most likely case then is that his prominence in the first book was considered reasonable evidence for the title of both books. The outline of 1 Samuel is in your worksheet, and it goes as follows. So first, we read about Eli, who was a priest and judge. This is in the 1st chapter through the 4th chapter. So in these chapters, we see the birth of Samuel, we see the sins of Eli and his sons, we see the two warnings to Eli, and then we see the judgment of Eli. In the second part of the outline, we can see Samuel is the main focus. He is prophet, priest, and judge. Now, this is in chapter 5 through chapter 8. So the ark is restored to Israel. There's revival and victory under Samuel. And then Israel asks for a king, which brings us to our third part, looking at Saul, who was Israel's first king. So this then would be chapter 9 through chapter 15. So Saul is anointed by Samuel. He is praised after a victory. He becomes the king. He fails to wait for Samuel. He defeats the Philistines and others. And then he disobeys at the Amalekite victory. Which brings us then to David, a national hero, in chapter 16 through chapter 31. So David then is anointed and he kills Goliath. Saul seeks to kill David, and Jonathan, his son, actually befriends David. We see David fleeing and Saul hunting for him. The Philistines give David refuge. Saul consults a witch at Endor. David recovers his family and his wealth. And lastly, Saul dies in chapter 31. So let's look at each of these in a little more detail. So like I said, chapters 1 through 4 records the account of Eli the priest. First Samuel relates several thrilling stories within the context of Israel's continuing struggle with the Philistines, which lasted for approximately 400 years. So the book opens by telling us that Eli was the high priest and Hannah was praying at the house of the Lord because of her barrenness. The high priest wrongly concluded that Hannah was drunk because her lips were moving, but her voice was silent. When Hannah corrected him, Eli blessed her, saying, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." Well, God did answer Hannah's prayer, and Samuel was born. Meanwhile, God became angry because Eli did not discipline his sons. The consistent wickedness of Eli's sons contrasted with Samuel's desire to please God. God warned Eli twice before exercising judgment. The Philistines crushed Israel in battle. They stole the Ark of the Covenant, and they killed both of Eli's sons. Now, when news came to Eli, he was so shocked by the terrible report that he fell backwards and he died. So this brings us to chapters 5 through 8, and the focus now shifts to Samuel. Samuel was not only the last of the judges to rule Israel, but he was also a prophet. Now, although he was not from Aaron's family, he became the high priest as well. Samuel taught, he offered sacrifices, and he cleansed the lands from idols. Scripture commends Samuel for acting in a godly manner. While serving a rebellious people, he remained faithful and righteous. When the nation of Israel saw that the nations around them had kings, they wanted a king as well. And Samuel instinctively realized that a human king would become an idol in the eyes of Israel, replacing the one true king, God. Nevertheless, Israel rejected both Samuel's and God's advice and demanded a king. So, chapter 9 through chapter 15 cover the rule and reign of King Saul. In spite of Israel's rejection of clear advice, God guided Samuel to Saul. Samuel anointed Saul as king privately, and then he publicly announced it to all the people at Mizpah. The king was the anointed of Yahweh. The sacredness of the office of king is the one element that characterized the reigns of both Saul and David. Only in the stories of Saul and David are we told that the Spirit came upon them during their anointing. However, although God selected and anointed Saul for kingship, Saul had many character weaknesses. At Gilgal, when Samuel did not arrive on time to offer sacrifices, Saul grew impatient and disobeyed God by offering the sacrifices himself. Later, Saul again disobeyed God by not completely destroying the Amalekites as the Lord had instructed. Through Samuel, God rebuked Saul for his arrogance and his rebellion. Saul's pride became his downfall. Saul's son Jonathan, however, had tremendous faith in God, stating, "Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." Jonathan led his armor bearer in a daring attack against a Philistine outpost. After scaling a cliff, the two of them killed about 20 Philistines, and God honored Jonathan's faith and courage by sending a panic through the rest of the Philistine army. Jonathan later became one of David's best and most committed friends. The remainder of the book, this is chapters 16 through 31, introduce us to David. In rejecting Saul as king, the Lord sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people. Thus, David was God's choice as Saul's successor. As with Saul, Samuel anointed David privately, and Saul was unaware of it, indicating why he chose David over some of David's brothers. God reminded Samuel that the Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. David soon began serving Saul as a musician and armor bearer, splitting his time between Saul's service and his father Jesse's sheep. However, after killing Goliath, the giant Philistine, David became increasingly popular in Israel, and Saul grew dangerously jealous. Saul tried to kill David, both indirectly and directly. But with the Lord's help, David escaped each attempt. Finally, by way of a message from Jonathan, David knew he had to flee for his life. 1 Samuel recounts the events of David's flight from Saul and Saul's pursuit, as well as Israel's continuing trouble with the Philistines, with whom David had taken refuge. Before the last battle with the Philistines recorded in 1 Samuel, Saul consulted a witch at Endor about the outcome because the Lord did not answer him. He learned that Israel would be defeated and that his kingdom would go to David, just as the Lord had promised some years before. Now, in the meantime, David and his men had begun to accompany the Philistines to battle, but were ordered to turn back. Finding their encampments raided and their families and possessions taken, David and his men pursued the raiders and recovered everything. David went after the raiding party only after the Lord assured him that he would be successful. The final chapter of 1 Samuel records the fierce battle against the Philistines, the deaths of Saul's sons, including Jonathan and Saul's death by suicide. Yet, despite the tragic ending and all the less than positive events in 1 Samuel, there are three theological stresses that emerge from this book, and we're going to look at them. These three theological stresses are in your worksheet. So first of all, there was the ancient promise of God that kings would issue from the patriarchs. We see this is fulfilled here. Genesis 17:6 says, I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. Genesis 35:11 tells us, and God said to him, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will be among your descendants. Second, the book reveals the error of attempting to run ahead of the promises of God and to bring to pass with human effort what only God can and should do. Third, the book teaches the principle that the all-wise and all-powerful God is sovereign, and when nations or individuals submit to his dominion, there is great blessing. So that brings us to David's reign in 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. We learned that 1 and 2 Samuel were together as one book in the Hebrew Scriptures. Remember, however, that the author of 2 Samuel is unknown. There are some, however, who point out that it's possible the prophets Nathan and Gad wrote it. Again, with Chronicles, the author is not specifically named, although some tradition point to the possibility of Ezra as the author. The rule of David, whom many regard as the greatest of Israel's kings, is described in 2 Samuel and in 1 Chronicles. While 1 Samuel covers about 100 years from Samuel's birth to Saul's death, like I said, this is like 1105 to 1010 BC. 2 Samuel confines its coverage to David's rule. This is a period of 40 years. So this would be from 1010 to 970 BC. 2 Samuel may have been written in the late 10th century BC after David's death. Providing many details of David's reign, 2 Samuel is the only book that tells us about the sin and rebellion in David's family. 1 Chronicles shows that David began a dynasty in Israel. It emphasizes David as a leader in politics and religion and records his work in preparing to build the temple. The outline of David's reign, the event or topic, and where it's found is in your worksheet. Following Saul's death, the commander of his army, Abner, helped to crown Saul's son Ishbosheth as king of Israel. Because scholars disagree about the time factors in Ishbosheth's reign and other aspects, we will focus on David's reign. David was living in Philistia when he heard of Saul's death. After mourning for Saul and Jonathan, David returned to Hebron, where the people of Judah anointed him as their king. Tension and hostility arose until the nation of Israel began to realize that David did not hate Saul's family and had no plans to harm Ishbosheth or Abner. In fact, David initiated peace talks between the tribes. Eventually, after Abner and Ishbosheth were killed without David's approval, David became king over all the tribes of Israel. First, then we see David's political success. So this would be 2 Samuel 1 through 5 and 1 Chronicles 1 through 10. As the new king, David sought a new capital city that was more centrally located and politically neutral. Thus, he set his sights on Jerusalem. The Jebusites, who controlled Jerusalem, were Canaanites whom Israel had never driven out. Also, Jerusalem sat high on a hill and was surrounded by tall, thick walls. The Jebusites were confident that their city was impenetrable, but David's army entered Jerusalem through its water tunnel. Joab led the army in defeating the Jebusites and, as a reward for this military victory, became the commander of David's army. Many Old Testament writings call Jerusalem the city of David. The city is also called Zion, which perhaps is the name of the fort that David took from the Jebusites. As David organized the nation from Jerusalem, the city became the place of authority for all of Israel. The loyal men who assisted David when Saul tried to kill him became leaders in this new kingdom. Later, with materials from Tyre, David built a palace for himself in Jerusalem. Now, although the Philistines had not been concerned when David was king at Hebron, they grew alarmed when he became king of the whole nation. David and his army's 2 previous victories over the Philistines may have led to his kingship over all Israel. After asking God for direction, David fought against the Philistines twice more, and he defeated them. Before the second battle, the Lord told David, "As soon as you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the poplar trees, move quickly, because that will mean the Lord has gone out in front of you to strike the Philistine army." God blessed David with victory because of his obedience. The next thing that we see is David's spiritual success. This is in 2 Samuel 6 and 7 and 1 Chronicles 11 through 17. Jerusalem became not only the political and geographical center of Israel, but also its religious center. In time, David brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and put it in a tent or tabernacle. David reinstated the ministry of the priests and Levites and led the entire nation in worshiping the one true God. David desired to build a temple for God because he felt the Lord deserved a better place for his name. He was distressed that he himself lived in a palace while the Ark of the Covenant remained in a tent. When he approached the prophet Nathan about building a temple, at first Nathan considered it a good idea and gave David the go-ahead. However, that night God revealed to Nathan that it would be David's son who would be the one to build the temple. Although David was a man after God's own heart, he was also a man of war and a king who had shed much blood. So David's son Solomon, a man of peace, would build God's temple. Some intentional irony occurs in the Bible narrative as God promises to build a house for David. That is, he promises that David's kingdom would continue forever. The earthly kingdom or dynasty of David did not last forever. It ended when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, conquered Judah and overthrew its kings. Instead, God's covenant promise to David was fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ, our Savior and Messiah. Jesus is called the Son of David in the New Testament and is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, who will rule and reign forever. Third, we see David's military success. So this is 2 Samuel 8 through 10, and this is also found in 1 Chronicles 18 and 19. Israel became a leading nation of the Fertile Crescent in the 10th century BC. Under both David's and Solomon's reign, the kingdom stretched from the southern edge of the Negev desert to the Euphrates River of Mesopotamia. Although the Philistines created many problems for Israel, they were masters at craftsmanship, particularly forging iron weapons and tools. While David was hiding from Saul in Philistia, he learned numerous things, possibly including how to make iron. As 1 Chronicles 22:3 indicates, Israel used iron during David's reign. David greatly improved the military strength of Israel. David liberated Israel from Philistine oppression and incorporated their territories and peoples under his rule. Then he started building an extended empire. Israel became the dominant power in Western Asia. His reason for conquering Edom was to extract tribute from them and perhaps to acquire iron and copper. David also conquered the Moabites and Amalekites, taking gold and silver from them. When Syria and Ammon joined to fight against David, he defeated both of them. After this great victory, all the kings subject to Syria made peace with Israel and were subject to them. The fourth thing that we see are David's sins. So 2 Samuel 11 through 12:14 shows us this part of David's life. The Bible does not hide the sins of Israel's leaders. In fact, the Bible is quite detailed about David's sin and his shame. While 2 Samuel 1 through 10 recounts the wonderful years of David's success, 2 Samuel 11 through 24 tells of his years of sorrow. Success can lead to spiritual danger. Once power and authority have been achieved, they can easily be abused. David's reveling in his military, his political, and his spiritual success may have played a role in his sin. One night, David walked out on his roof because he could not sleep. Upon noticing a beautiful woman bathing, he desired her. At his inquiry, he learned that she was Bathsheba, the wife of one of his soldiers, Uriah. David sent for Bathsheba, and he had sexual relations with her. And when she informed him that she was pregnant, David tried to manipulate Uriah into coming home and sleeping with Bathsheba. Now, when that didn't work, David plotted to have Uriah killed on the front lines of war. This plot succeeded, and Bathsheba became one of David's wives. Displeased, the Lord sent the prophet Nathan to David. The prophet told David a suspenseful story about a lamb, and David became so angry that he demanded the offending party pay restitution and die. Nathan then shocked David with the words, "You are the man." 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 15 through chapter 15, verse 6 is where we read about the death of David's son from adultery. We see the judgment on David's household. We see Amnon's rape of Tamar, his half-sister, and Absalom's revenge and deceit. Judgment on David's kingdom is seen in 2 Samuel 15 through 20. So judgment came not only on David and the succeeding generations of his family, but also on his kingdom. This judgment was marked by the sword as well as discord within his family. Yet God forgave David and took away his sin. Moreover, the Bible records that the Lord loved Solomon and that Christ came through the lineage of David through his relationship with Bathsheba. So, how do we balance the biblical reality about the sinful failures of leadership with the extension of God's grace? This theological tension exists throughout the Old and New Testaments. David has frequently been put on a high pedestal as a spiritual giant. Yet David committed a number of serious errors. These came not from ignorance of what is right, but from being impulsively driven by the need of the moment without reflecting on the consequences. His lies cost people their lives. His temper jeopardizes his royal destiny. His duplicity led him to execute civilians. His lust entangled him in a murderous plot. His unwillingness to take firm disciplinary action contributed to the bloodshed within his family. And his pride brought a pestilence that devastated the land. Yet God chose David and affirmed that he walked in accordance to his law. David was loyal to the Lord and recognized when he had committed sin. A balanced view of David recognizes his godliness, but realizes that, like any of us, he was not immune to lapses in judgment. Perhaps David's life is one of several reasons why the New Testament exhorts believers to watch yourself, or you also may be tempted. Finally, we see David's last years in 2 Samuel 21 through 24, 1 Chronicles 21 through 22, and 29. Throughout David's kingship, he had been a man of war, succeeding in making Jerusalem the capital and defeating many nations who had threatened Israel. Under his rule, Israel rose to her greatest height. David accomplished many great things with the Lord's help and maintained a heart attitude that pleased God. Yet David's rule was not perfect or not problematic. His sin resulted in numerous problems that plagued him for years. In divine judgment for one of Saul's long ago misdeeds, God placed Israel under a famine for 3 years. Then, against Joab's objections, David insisted on counting the fighting men. Now this angered the Lord, who sent a plague against the nation. When David built an altar on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, according to God's orders, the judgment stopped. David spent the last 10 years of his life making plans and arrangements for Solomon to build the temple. He instructed the priests and princes to recognize Solomon as their new king. David's last words, recorded in 2 Samuel 23, 1 through 7, sound much like a prayer or a psalm, although they reflect on his relationship with God. David died after serving as king for 40 years. Getting into our last area of study for this lesson, we see that together the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings recount the complete history of the kings from Saul to Zedekiah, Judah's last king. We see that these books also record some of the better known prophets of that time period. The authors of 1st and 2nd Kings are unknown, but the books were likely finished about 560 to 550 BC. Like the books of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings were one book in the Hebrew Scriptures, covering a span of about 400 years from 970 to 560 BC. The books were written for Jews exiled in Babylon to reveal God's perspective on Hebrew history and to explain reasons for the divided kingdom. The outline of Solomon's reign in your worksheet is broken up into 4 sections. So first, in 1 Kings 1 through 4 and 2 Chronicles 1, Solomon becomes king. Peace and prosperity describe the golden years of Solomon's rule. Under David, the nation had become united, had expanded its borders, and was respected by other nations. Now Solomon benefited from David's military victories, and his peaceful reign lasted for 40 years. As we consider the stories of the kings, we should note that Scripture does not always record historical events in chronological order. For instance, 1 Kings describes the first temple and then relates how Solomon obtained the materials to build it. The book also tells us about Solomon's palace before recounting the dedication of the temple, which occurred 13 years before the palace was built. The building of the temple occurred during the first 10 years of Solomon's reign. Solomon may have been between 21 and 25 years old when he became king. Realizing that the position, the responsibility, and the workload would be demanding, he sought divine wisdom. Pleased with Solomon's prayer, God promised him wisdom, as well as wealth and honor. However, God exhorted Solomon to be obedient to divine directives and walk closely to him, as his father David had done. People were impressed with Solomon's great wisdom and came from all nations to seek his advice. His wisdom in ruling helped the kingdom to grow even larger. He divided the country into 12 districts for tax purposes, with each district providing the government with supplies for 1 month. King Solomon added greatly to the numerical and military strength of Israel's army, keeping part of the army in special cities and the rest of the army in Jerusalem. The next thing we see in the reign of King Solomon are his building programs. This is 1 Kings 5 through 9 and 2 Chronicles 2, 1 through 8:16. Solomon led the nation in several building programs, including the temple in Jerusalem. He built the temple on the site of the threshing floor where David had made sacrifices to stop the plague his census had caused. The threshing floor was on Mount Moriah, but it is uncertain whether or not this was the same Mount Moriah where Abraham traveled to sacrifice Isaac. The temple was approximately twice as large as the tabernacle. It was very beautiful, and many of the articles inside were covered with gold. The temple was completed about 950 BC, during the time of Israel's greatest growth, and it fulfilled David's desire. The temple was a permanent place for the people to worship God. Solomon dedicated the temple to God during the Feast of Tabernacles by leading the people in worship, praying, and delivering a message. One of the most important events in Israel's history after they left Mount Sinai, the temple dedication, occurred 480 years after Israel left Egypt. The people followed the divinely prescribed order of music and worship as the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant into the most holy place. As a result, God's glory fell, and his presence filled the temple. When Nebuchadnezzar defeated Judah in 586 BC, he destroyed Solomon's temple. In 516 BC, after 70 years of captivity in Babylon, Israel built a second temple known as Zerubbabel's temple. In a later era, Herod built another temple for the Jews, but it was destroyed in AD 70 by the Roman army. After he built the temple, Solomon built a palace for himself, which, like I mentioned, took 13 years to complete. It contained government offices, and an area for Pharaoh's daughter. This was one of Solomon's wives, as well as Solomon's own living quarters. The third thing we see in the reign of King Solomon are Solomon's international relations. We read about these in 1 Kings 9 through 10 and 2 Chronicles 8 through 9. At the end of David's rule, Israel had many iron and copper mines, which made the nation powerful in business and trade. With the help of the Phoenicians, Solomon built ships to carry this iron and copper to other nations, some as far as southwest Arabia and Ethiopia. There he traded for gold, silver, ivory, and monkeys. Israel also gained wealth by trading spices with other countries. The horses and chariots Solomon obtained from the Hittites increased his military strength, and his powerful army enabled him to control trade in the entire region. Political expediency led Solomon to establish mutually agreeable international relations with other countries. This may have included an alliance with the Queen of Sheba, who was amazed by Solomon's wisdom, saying it far exceeded the report she had heard. The final thing we see in the reign of King Solomon is Solomon's disobedience and his death in 1 Kings 11. So the final chapter of Solomon's life is sobering. Despite his great wisdom and wealth, his life ended in failure and defeat. Like other kings, he confirmed treaties and sealed alliances by marrying the king's daughters. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines or secondary wives. According to 1 Kings 11 verse 2, however, God had warned the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." However, Solomon allowed his love for these women to override his wisdom and his obedience. He permitted his wives to worship idols and constructed temples for the false gods, even worshiping a few other gods himself. As a result, Solomon's heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God. Early in Solomon's reign, he entered a political alliance with Egypt, which involved a royal wedding to the daughter of Pharaoh. This hinted at future trouble. Large royal harems were not uncommon in those days. Solomon's numerous political marriages seemed an innocent way to strengthen foreign alliances. But God had specifically forbidden such intermarriages. Now, in Solomon's old age, the religious apostasy his foreign wives brought into the royal court adversely affected his faith. He slowly and gradually drifted from an exclusive monotheism and began incorporating the worship of other gods. Religious compromise is almost never swift and obvious. It happens gradually as one drifts slowly away from God. Because of Solomon's disobedience, God told him that he would divide the kingdom. But for David's sake, the division would not happen until Solomon died. Even before his death, however, Solomon saw enemies begin to arise. Yet, a theological theme in 1 Kings is that the sovereignty of God, which, despite human failings, continues to carry forward his eternal purposes. Now, before we review our lesson, let's look at your homework for the week. So, homework for the week, you are to read about the kingdom beginnings, the reign of David or the reign of Solomon. Choose one of these three things that we looked at. Now, you can follow the outline that is in your worksheet to break up your reading if you need to do it in more than one day. And as always, if you choose to use an audio Bible, that's fine too. Sometimes I find myself reading along while listening to an audio Bible, so you might try something like that. Remember, the important thing is not to just check this off your to-do list or get it done in a day or a couple days or even a week, even though I call it homework for the week. Take your time to work through this, to study through it, to understand what's going on, review the worksheet, and then move on to the next lesson. So, looking at our lesson review, question 1 is, what does 1 Samuel record? It records the point where Israel turned from judges to kings. Question 2, what does 2 Samuel cover and tell us about? 2 Samuel covers David's rule. This is a period of 40 years and tells about the sin and rebellion in David's family. Question 3, what does 1 Chronicles show, emphasize, and record? It shows David began a dynasty. It emphasizes David as a leader. It records his work in preparing to build the temple. Question 4, who was Israel's first king? This would be Saul. Question 5, who was Judah's last king? This would be Zedekiah.